The Silent Mountain. For 1,000 years, the mountain stood untouched. It did not belong to the land the way other mountains did. It did not rise gently from rolling hills, nor did it crown itself with snow that fed rivers and forests below. It erupted. It tore itself from the earth like a wound that never healed, jagged and black, its edges too sharp, too unnatural to have been shaped by time alone. The people of the lowlands called it many names. The Broken Fang, the Black Spine, the End of Sky. But none of those names were spoken near it, not aloud, not even in whispers carried by trembling lips, for there were places in the world where names had weight, and this was one of them. It loomed over the horizon from every direction, its silhouette cutting into the heavens like a blade. At dawn, it devoured the light. At dusk, it swallowed the last warmth of the sun. Even the stars seemed to avoid lingering above it for too long, as if the sky itself feared being watched. Nothing lived upon its slopes. Or rather, nothing chose to. Grass would not grow there. Seeds carried by the wind would land, settle, and simply fail. They did not rot, nor did they sprout. They remained as they were, suspended in a quiet refusal to exist. Animals that strayed too close grew restless. Herds would veer away miles before reaching its base, their instincts screaming in a language older than thought. Birds altered their migrations to arc wide around it, leaving a hollow circle in the sky that never changed, no matter the season. Even insects avoided the place. Even decay hesitated. The air itself felt wrong. Travelers who passed within sight of the mountain spoke of a pressure that settled behind their eyes, a weight that grew heavier the longer they looked. It was not pain, not at first. It was awareness, a creeping, suffocating certainty that something vast was looking back. And it did not blink. The winds that circled the mountain were unpredictable. At times they howled like grieving voices, tearing at the stone in endless fury. At others they fell utterly silent, leaving a stillness so complete it felt as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath. Those who lingered too long in that silence often claimed they could hear something else. A sound beneath the quiet. Low and endless. A distant rumble that did not belong to earth or sky. Like thunder frozen in place. The old stories warned against listening. The old stories warned against looking. The old stories warned against climbing. And so for 1,000 years no one did. Not truly. There had been attempts in the early centuries. There were always attempts. Heroes they called themselves. Men and women wrapped in iron and conviction, carrying blades forged with prayers and purpose. They came with banners and vows, with songs already written about victories not yet earned. They came to slay the dragon. None of them reached the summit. Some turned back long before the climb began, overcome by a dread they could not name. Others pressed onward, stubborn and proud, only to falter as the air thinned and the mountain's presence pressed against their minds. A few disappeared entirely. No bodies were ever found. No weapons, no armor, no trace of their passing. It was as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. In time, even the bravest kingdoms stopped sending their champions. The cost was too high, the silence too complete. No victory songs returned from the slopes. No tales of glory echoed from the peak. Only absence. Only quiet. And so the mountain remained. Unchallenged. Untouched. Forgotten at least in action, if not in memory. But the dragon was never truly forgotten. How could he be? His story was older than the nations that now stood upon the land. Older than their kings, their wars, their fragile histories carved into parchment and stone. His name, once spoken with terror, had faded from common use, replaced by titles and warnings. The Bound Ones. The World Breakers. The Ash King. They said he had once darkened the sky with his wings, casting shadows that stretched across entire kingdoms. They said his breath had turned rivers to steam and forests to cinders in moments. That mountains had cracked beneath his fury, and oceans themselves had recoiled from his presence. Some claimed he had not merely destroyed armies, he had erased them, left nothing behind but scorched earth and echoes. Others said he had been more than a beast. That he had thought, planned, chosen, that his destruction had not been mindless, but deliberate. That made the stories worse, because it meant he could decide to do it again. And so the chains were forged, not by one kingdoms, not by one peoples, but by many. Old alliances were formed in desperation. Enemies laid down their swords long enough to face a greater threat. Smiths and mages, priests and scholars all brought their knowledge together, weaving craft and magic into something that had never existed before. Chains that could bind a god. Or something close enough to one. The forging took years. The journey to the mountain took more. In the battles, the stories of the battle were fragmented, broken, inconsistent. Some said it lasted days. Others said it lasted weeks. A few whispered it lasted longer, that time itself had twisted in the dragon's presence, stretching moments into eternity. But all agreed on one thing. They had not defeated him. They had endured him. And in that endurance, they had found a way to bind him. The chains were not merely metal. They were meanings. They were purpose given form. Each link etched with runes older than written language, symbols that did not describe power but commanded it. They did not weaken the dragon, they did not diminish what he was. They anchored him, pinned him to the world like a nail driven through something too vast to be held. When the final chain was placed, when the last rune was sealed, the mountain itself changed. The stone cracked and reshaped, rising around the dragon like a cage grown from the earth. The peak hardened, blackened, fused into something closer to glass than rock. The sky above it darkened. And the dragons stopped, not dead, never dead, but still, bound. The armies that survived did not celebrate. There were no songs of victory, no triumphant marches back to waiting cities. They left the mountain in silence, carrying their wounded, their losses far outweighing any sense of success. They had not won. They had only prevented something worse. And so they agreed. No one would return. No one would disturb the prison. The dragon would remain. And the world would move on. Centuries passed. Kingdoms rose and fell, borders shifted, wars were fought over land, over power, over pride. Generations lived and died, their lives brief sparks against the vastness of time. The mountain endured. Always there. Always watching. The stories changed as they were passed down, details faded, names were lost. The truth blurred into myth, into warning, into something told to children to keep them from wandering too far. Do not go near the mountains. Do not look at it for too long. Do not listen to the silence. Because something is listening back. Few believed the stories in full. But no one ignored them entirely. Even the most skeptical travelers felt it, the unease, the pressure, the instinctive need to turn away. And so they did, always. The mountain remained untouched. Because it wanted to be. At its summit, the dragon waited. He did not sleep. He could not. The chains did not allow for rest, not true rest. They held him in a state between motion and stillness, awareness and stagnation. His body was pinned, his wings folded tight against his sides, his limbs anchored into the stone. His jaws were bound, not fully but enough. Enough to prevent the fire. Enough to prevent the end. But not enough to silence him. He breathed. Slowly. Carefully. Each inhale drawn through centuries of stillness, each exhale controlled with a precision that bordered on restraint. The air around him shimmered with heat, though no flame emerged. The chains glowed faintly where they touched him. Not always. Only when he moved. Which was rare. Movement brought pains. Not physical pain, not in the way lesser creatures understood it. His body was beyond such limitations. But the chains responded to motion, tightening, humming, reinforcing their hold. Reminding him. He had tested them in the early years. Tested them with force that had once shattered mountains. They did not break. They did not bend. They held. And so eventually he had stopped trying. But he had not stopped thinking. His eyes remained open. They had always been open. Two vast orbs of molten gold, dimmed by time but never extinguished. They stared out across the horizon, across the shifting world below, across the endless passage of years. He watched the storms roll in and break against the mountain. Watched lightning gather above him, drawn to something it did not understand. It struck the chains often, dancing along the etched runes in blinding arcs of light. The chains held. He watched the seasons change. Though the mountain itself did not change with them. Snow fell but never stayed. It melted before it could settle, hissing into vapor as it touched his scales or the stone around him. Rain turned to steam before it could pool. Nothing lingered. Nothing remained. Time moved, but not here. Here it stretched, thinned, lost its meaning. Years blurred into decades, decades into centuries. The world below shifted, but the summit remained constant, a point outside of change, anchored by the chains and the will that had forged them. The dragon remembered everything. He remembered the battles. He remembered the faces, those who had stood against him, their fear, their determination, their defiance. He remembered the moment the chains had taken hold, the sudden stillness, the abrupt end of motion. He remembered rage. A rage so vast it had nearly torn the world apart in its final expression. But that rage had nowhere to go. Not anymore. So it faded. Not entirely. Never entirely. But enough. In its place came something else. Not peace. Never peace. But awareness. Time gave perspective even to something like him. He saw the world change. Saw the rise of new kingdoms, the fall of old ones, saw wars ignite and extinguish like brief sparks, saw humanity grow, falter, rebuild, repeat. They were persistent, fragile, short-lived, and yet they endured. That more than anything held his attention. Because they continued. Despite everything. Despite him. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when he wondered what they had become. What they would become. If they would remember him. Or if eventually even his shadow would fade from their stories. But then the storms would gather. The chains would hum. And he would remember. He was still here. Still bound. Still watching. Still waiting. For what he did not know. Until the day something changed. It was subtle at first. So subtle that even he almost dismissed it. A disturbance in the pattern. A shift in the silence. Something approaching. The dragon's gaze lowered, slowly, deliberately, his vision sweeping down the endless slope of the mountain. For a long moment there was nothing. Only stone. Only wind. Only the same emptiness that had defined the mountain for 1,000 years. And then, movement. Small. Insignificant. A speck against the vastness of the black stone. A human's. Climbing. The dragon stilled. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. For 1,000 years none had come this far. For 1,000 years the mountain had remained untouched. And yet, there against all reason, against all instinct, against the weight of 1,000 years of silence, a human climbed. The hand that reached. The human was small. That was the dragon's first thought. Not small in the way creatures were small to him, everything was small compared to something that had once blotted out the sky. No, this was something else. This was a different kind of small. A smallness that spoke of fragility, of brevity, of a life that would flicker out before a single memory of his could fade. After centuries of silence, the sight of movement alone was enough to stir something long dormant. But as the dragon's gaze followed the figure inching its way up the jagged slope, a deeper awareness began to unfold. A human's. Alive. Climbing. The absurdity of it lingered. Time had swallowed countless things, kingdoms, names, entire civilizations reduced to dust, but still they came. Still, these brief, defiant creatures threw themselves against the impossible. He had seen it before. Long ago. When the chains were new and the memory of him still burned fresh in the world, they had come in numbers. Armored in steel, cloaked in magic, crowned in purpose. They had called themselves heroes, saviors, champions of the living. They had believed themselves necessary. They had believed themselves destined. None had reached him. The mountain had taken them. Not by force. Not always. Sometimes it was the air too thin, too heavy with something unseen. Sometimes it was the mind, unraveling under the weight of something vast pressing back against their thoughts. Sometimes it was something simpler. Fear. Pure, instinctive, undeniable fear. They would stop, turn, flee. Or they would continue until their strength failed, their bodies collapsing against the cold, black stone claimed not by the dragon but by the climb itself. And those who came with magic. The mountain devoured that too. Spells unraveled before they could take shape. Power slipped through fingers like water. The closer they came, the less the world obeyed them. The mountain did not reject them. It simply did not care. And in that indifference, they were erased. So many had tried. So many had failed. And then, none came at all. For centuries, silence reclaimed the slopes. The world learned slowly to leave the mountain alone. Until now, the dragon watched. At first, there was no interest, only observation, the same distant awareness he gave to storms and lightning and the shifting of clouds. The human was far below, barely more than a moving point against the endless dark of stone. But the movement continued. Slow, deliberate, unyielding. The dragon's gaze did not leave it. Hours passed, then more. The human did not stop, did not falter. There were places on the mountain where the stone sharpened into blades, where a single misstep meant a fall into nothingness. There were ridges where the wind howled with enough force to tear flesh from bone, where even the strongest would be driven back. The human passed through them. Not untouched. Never untouched. The dragon could see it even from afar. The slight stumbles, the pauses that lingered a little too long, the way the body languid, adjusted, endured. Fragile, breakable, and yet, still climbing. No armor gleamed in the dim light. No weapon weighed at their side. No aura of magic bent the air around them. There was only the humans. And the climb. The dragon's eyes narrowed slightly. Curiosity. It had been a long time since he had felt anything close to it. Most things had lost their meaning over the centuries. Repetition wore them down, reduced them to patterns. Storms came and went. Lightning struck. The world below shifted endlessly. But this was new. Or perhaps not new. Perhaps forgotten. The human reached the mid-slope as the sky darkened. Night came slowly, shadows stretching across the mountains, swallowing detail until only outlines remained. The human should have stopped. Should have sought shelter. Should have waited for light. They did not. They climbed in the dark. The dragon watched as the small figure moved through shadow, guided by something other than sight. There was hesitation, yes, but not doubt. Never doubt. The wind rose. It screamed across the mountain, tearing at stone and air alike. It should have thrown the human from the slope, dashed them against the rocks far below. But the human held. Clinging. Enduring. The dragon exhaled slowly, a low rumble that echoed through the peak. The air around him shimmered with heat, distorting the darkness. Still they climbed. By the time dawn came, the human was close. Closer than any had been in centuries. The dragon felt something shift. Not in the chains. Not in the mountains. In himself. Awareness sharpened. Focus narrowed. For the first time in 1,000 years, his attention was no longer endless, no longer stretched across the horizon. It centered on the humans. The final stretch of the climb was the most difficult. The slope steepened, the stones smoothing into an almost glass-like surface that offered little grip. The air grew heavier, thick with the presence that saturated the peak. This was where most had failed. This was where the mountain ended the climb. The human paused. Just for a moment. Standing on a narrow ledge, looking up toward the summit where the dragon lay bound. The distance was not far. Not anymore. The dragon met their gaze. Even from that distance, he could see their face. So small, so still, no fear, no only understanding. The dragon did not like that. Something about it felt wrong. Humans feared him. They were supposed to. It was not arrogance, it was truth. He had given them every reason to fear. He had burned their cities, shattered their armies, reshaped their world through destruction. Fear was the correct response. Fear was the only response that made sense. And yet, this one did not show it. The human moved again. Step by step, they climbed the final stretch. And the mountains allowed it. No sudden wind rose to tear them away. No unseen force crushed their mind or body. The air remained heavy but not suffocating. The dragon felt it. The absence. The lack of resistance. For 1,000 years, the mountain had guarded him, protected the prison. And now, it did nothing. The human reached the summit. They stood upon the black stone, the world stretching endlessly behind them, the sky vast and open above. And before them, the dragons, bound, colossal, unmoving. The chains glowed faintly, runes etched deep into their surface pulsing with a quiet, constant power. They wrapped around him, anchored him to find him. They were part of him now. After so long, it was difficult to imagine existence without them. The human took a step forward. Then another. There was no hesitation. No pause to gather courage. No moment of doubts. They simply walked. The dragon lowered his head. The movement was slow, deliberate, the chains responding with a low, resonant hum as they tightened slightly, reinforcing their hold. The sound rolled across the summit like distant thunder. The human did not stop. They came closer. Close enough that the heat radiating from the dragon's body should have been unbearable. Close enough that the pressure of his presence should have crushed them. And yet, they stood, looking up. The dragon studied them. Every detail, every breath, every subtle movement. There was no armor to protect them, no weapon to defend them, no magic to shield them. Just flesh, just bone, just will. You should not be here. The words were not spoken. They were imposed. A vibration that passed through the air, through the stone, through the very fabric of the world itself. The mountain trembled in response, cracks whispering along its surface. The human did not flinch. I know. The answer was small, insignificant, and yet it held. It existed in the space the dragon's voice created, unbroken, unchanged. Silence followed. Long, heavy. The wind returned, circling the summit in slow, restless currents. It tugged at the human's clothing, whispered against the stone, but neither moved. You fear me. It was not a question. It was a statement. A truth that had defined every encounter, every memory, every moment of his existence with their kind. No, the word was simple. Unadorned. Absolute. The dragon's eyes narrowed. You should. A pause. A breath. Maybe, the human said, but that's not why I came. The dragon watched them. Something shifted deep beneath the layers of time and stillness. Curiosity. Sharper now. Focused. Then why? The human stepped closer. The distance between them vanished. Now they stood within reach. Within death. The dragon could end them with a thought. A breath. A fraction of what he was. And yet, he did not. The heat around him intensified, the air warping, shimmering with restrained power. Flame pressed against the back of his throat, eager, waiting. He held it back. For the first time in centuries. He chose not to destroy. The human raised a hand. The movement was slow. Careful, not out of fear but intention. They reached toward the chains. The mountain screamed. The reaction was immediate. Violent. The runes etched into the metal ignited, blazing with a light so bright it shattered the darkness, casting harsh shadows across the summit. Power surged outward, raw and uncontrolled, crackling through the air like a waking storm. The ground trembled. The sky split with distant thunder. Stop. The dragon's voice cut through it all. Deeper, sharper, not a command. A warning. The human's hand paused, hovering inches from the chain. The light burned. The power surged. Everything in the world seemed to recoil from the contact that had not yet happened. They said you were a monster, the human said quietly. The dragon's gaze hardened. I am. There was no hesitation. No denials. Only truth. They said you would destroy the world if you were freed. I would. Again, no hesitation. The words carried weight, not threat, not promise. Fact. The human nodded. I believe them. The dragon leaned closer. The chains groaned, resisting the movement but allowing enough for him to draw nearer. his presence pressed down, immense, undeniable. "Then why," he said, his voice low, dangerous, "do you touch what binds me?" The human did not step back, did not lower their gaze. Their hand remained where it was, between fear and action, between caution and defiance. And then, it moved forward, closing the distance. Fingers brushed against the chain, and the world broke. Light exploded outward, blinding, searing, consuming. The runes flared with a fury that had not been seen since the moment of their creation, their power surging against the intrusion. The mountain shook. Cracks tore through the stone, racing outward like fractures in glass. The sky roared, thunder splitting the air as lightning lashed down, drawn to the sudden, violent surge of energy. The chain burned. It should have destroyed the human instantly, should have reduced them to ash, erased their existence in the face of the power it contained. But it did not, because the human did not let go. Their hand closed around the metal, tight, unyielding. Because the human said, their voice steady despite the chaos, "You're still here." The words cut through everything. Through the light, through the storm, through the 1,000 years of silence. The dragon stilled. Something moved within him. Not the chains, not the mountains. Something older. Something buried beneath centuries of stillness and restraint. Something that had no name. The light surged higher. The chains trembled. And for the first time in 1,000 years, something changed.